and welcome everybody either listening to this live or at some point in the future on BatAbility Club. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And I am delighted today to be joined by Morgan Hughes and Scott Brown, who are going to be our guests on BatAbility Club, talking about advanced BAT surveys, when to call it a night. How are you guys doing? Morgan, how are you doing? Looking forward to this?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, we're doing great. We're in the throes of bat season, and it's nice to just have a chilled Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
Charging up all the detectors and everything behind us while we're at it.
Yeah. Scott, what would you normally be doing on a Sunday afternoon if you weren't round at Morgan's charging up bat detectors
waiting
and stuff?
for Sunday dinner. Yeah.
I never get Sunday dinner.
Sunday dinner.
Dinner. Okay. So what's for dinner tonight? Do you know? Have you decided?
No, not a clue. I'm here instead at the moment, but something good. I'm hoping anyway.
Okay. So what we're going to do, Morgan, I'm going to ask you to take over the screen and you're going to drive the bus. And please, if you're listening to this live, ask questions, put up banter, put up comments anytime you like on chat or the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on that. And I will feed Morgan and Scott any questions you might have. I'm quite sure I'll have a few questions as well. And we'll maybe save the questions to the end. I'll maybe interrupt you now and again if I feel it's timeous and appropriate to do so. So Morgan, are you able to take share? Are you able to do that? Or do I have to do something at this end? I maybe need to, oh no, you've got it, yeah. Here we go. Right, over to yourselves. Looking forward to this. And as I say, anybody there listening to this live, put stuff up on chat or Q&A and we'll take it from there. Okay, thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, thanks very much, Neil. It's really great to be invited to be part of this. We're big fans of BatAbility, and it's just nice to become part of the fold. So yes, I'm Morgan Hughes. I am the county bat recorder for Birmingham and the Black Country, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Wolverhampton. And I work as an ecologist, and I pretty much do bats all day, all night, every day, and that's me.
I'm Scott. I'm a freelance ecologist. Previously, full-time consultant, where I've been lucky enough to have access to BatAbility and flick through all of Neil's videos. So I'm Morgan's main research assistant for a PhD project. So that's me.
Okay. So this might be a familiar sight to some of you who do bat trapping. This is our volunteers heading over some fields towards a woodland, getting ready to set up for a night's trapping. This usually takes place. We arrive on site 2 hours before sunset. To allow enough time to, scope the site out and set up all the equipment and get everything ready to go before we open the nets at dusk. But when we were looking to start our project, we ran a pilot scheme in 2017 at 2 sites that had some disused limestone mines. And then in 2018, I approached the university to see if I could turn the project into a PhD. And then we were expanding, and we expanded to cover 11 urban woodland sites. I say urban, it's in a largely urban context, but most of our sites are in Greenbelt. Most of the sites were completely unrecorded with regard to bats. This one that they're walking to at the moment and in this slide is a private site that had no bat records whatsoever. But we had been asked by Natural England to take a look at the woodland a couple of years earlier, and so we included it. It's actually turned out to be the highest species richness in the county, actually, this little woodland. But when we were setting up, we were looking for protocols to sort of standardize how long we should be trapping, how many visits we should make to each site. And it was at that point when we realized that there is a shocking lack of specificity in guidelines, both UK guidelines and in European and international guidelines, with regard to survey effort for advanced bat license survey techniques. How long should the nets stay open? Once, first of all, what time should you open the nets? How long should they be open? How many nets should be deployed per site? And this can really vary. I mean, in all the years that we were doing our training, depending on who we were with, there would be drastic differences in the length of time. Most people survey for about 3 or 4 hours, but some continue until dawn. And I think a lot of the time, especially with we're going to try and pitch this so that you have a mixed audience, because I'm assuming you have a mixed audience of consultants and then also conservation back workers. And so your priorities when it comes to dealing with your resource management are different depending on what your background is and what the type of why you're doing your trapping. Are you doing it for a client or a project, or are you doing it for research? But either way, in volunteer run research, most of the time you've got one or two licensed people. I mean, this is how we run ours. We have with two of us are licensed, and then we have an army of volunteers who are many of them are graduates, some are retired, but a lot of them are just training to get their bat skilled, and they're working full-time jobs. And so to expect someone to have done a 40-hour week and then rock up on site and do 2 hours set up and then maybe go through till dawn is a little much to expect from a lot of people, especially if you're trapping on Fridays and Saturdays. To work around people's 40-hour weeks and then pulling a 12-hour shift on a Friday night, it's difficult. So even if you're not thinking about it from a financial point of view, you're thinking about it from a just logistics point of view, it would be really helpful to know how long you would need to actually be spending in each woodland. First of all, to know that you're putting in enough survey effort, but then also to get to a point where when is enough and when your resources are best used by moving on to another site. And so this is what we wanted to look at. It wasn't the main focus of the research, but it was just something that we looked at as we were going along, as we were collecting our data. But from a consultancy point of view, obviously time is money. For everyone that you have out on site doing advanced bat license survey techniques, you're paying them. Sometimes you're paying quite a lot for them, especially if they're running the project for you, and they're the extremely experienced licensed people. And so for every person, for every hour, it's costing you money or costing the client money. And so we really needed to know how many visits are required to be able to gather meaningful assemblage data. And could you just go in a single visit and get enough of an idea of a species assemblage? How much equipment should you be deploying? And also from a consultancy point of view, how much equipment do you need to own to be able to say that this is a type of survey that you can deliver? So as I said, the guidelines are pretty inconsistent, and Scott's going to go into that in a bit more detail, but with an awful gap in specificity with regard to how much survey effort you need.
So the existing UK and European guidelines for advanced surveys, like Morgan said, they're not very specific, they're not consistent. Eurobats will say one thing, the UK guidelines will say another thing, and then other guides people use, like Kate Barlow's work, will say something else. And that's not just because they're all from different parts of the world. There's other reasons, and one of the main reasons is no one's really kind of looked into it. It's all kind of, well, this is how I do it. So survey visits, how many you need, is changes. The start times, they change, although that's the most consistent out of all of them. The survey duration and the deployment of equipment, how much kit you need. Basically, everyone seems to agree that surveys should commence at the same time relative to sunset on each night. But the duration, that varies. So everyone seems to agree, yes, you need to get your traps up so they are up for sunset. But then how long after that is where a lot of variability comes into play. So some people, like the UK guidelines, specifies you should trap until a specific time rather than a specific duration. So trap until 2 or 3 a.m. rather than trap for 3 or 4 hours. And that can create varying in survey length. So for example, if you're trapping in the peak of summer when the nights are really short and your trapping day is going to be incredibly short, but then if you trap in, for example, a really late October survey, just when it's warm enough, like the last one you can feasibly squish in, you could be starting about 6 o'clock and you're not going to finish until 3 a.m. So all of a sudden, you're putting in a 9-hour shift almost. And that's problematic. And the biggest problematic is it's bias. In theory, it kind of might even out you spending more time surveying when there's less bats about because it's colder. But on the other time, it's like if you're out doing swarming survey, bats can swarm well into ridiculous times in winter. So that's basically the main issue. So this is a summary of the three main guidelines. We've got expedition field techniques by Kate Barlow, which was obviously done based in the neotropics, really. Eurobats, which is a Eurocentric viewpoint, and then the BCT good practice guidelines. So all of them pretty much agree. You start and you need to be up by sunset. Everything needs to be going for when it gets dark. But then the duration, Kate Barlow, either a few hours or all night. There's a bit of extreme variation there. I'm either here for like a couple of hours or I'm here till the sun comes up. But for the same number of hours each night. So she does at least say there should be consistency in length.
Yeah, hers is the most science.
Yeah. And Eurobats is 6 to 8 hours, but 3 to 4 is the most lucrative. Our work kind of doesn't really agree with that, but again, kind of consistent. And then the BCT good practice guidelines until 2 or 3 a.m., which can create massive variability, or much later for swarming. I kind of do understand the much later because swarming is something that it either happens or it doesn't, and it happens for as long as it happens. It doesn't. It
would be very difficult to prescribe survey hours for swarming.
What usually happens is the bats rock up about 11, 12 o'clock, disappear, and then they come back about 2 or 3 a.m. and then disappear. But they can just rock up at like 12 and then it goes absolutely crazy for ridiculous times, or they can just not turn up, or they can turn up only at 3 a.m. And that's just, our work isn't about swarming there. So checking of traps every Cape Barlow every 30 minutes or continuously impossible. I would not leave a mist net for half an hour. Eurobats every 3 to 10 minutes, which is a bit more reasonable, and then BCT good practice continuously with a bat detector or visually every 5 minutes. Number of surveys, Barlow doesn't really say, Eurobat doesn't really say. BCT good practice says depends on a number of factors for smaller projects, at least 3. Now, at least 3 is important because the UK class 3 and 4 licenses, which are consultant trapping licenses, the maximum amount of surveys you can do is 3. But we'll go into that again more. Equipment, the same configuration in the same area each night from Barlow. Eurobat, a minimum of 6 metre length per netting site. And a netting site is defined as a woodland of about 30 hectares. But that to me is like, if that's a site, well, what is it where you put your trap? To me, there's a lot of vagueness in there.
It's also that 60 meters it was in the 2009 draft of the Eurobats guidelines, but didn't make it into the final print.
Yeah, so that is just that's just from digging on the internet. Weather, again, Barlow's from the tropics. In the tropics, when it rains, you don't stop. So most conditions except very heavy rain or very strong winds. And then, but good practice guidelines, no prolonged rain and only in temps above 8 degrees C. The 8 degrees C, if you're doing swarming, bats will swarm until ridiculous temperatures again. So I know some people that have specific things in project licenses where they can trap in basically only just above freezing because the bats will just carry on going. They've got their mind on other things.
Yeah, if it's like swarming or constant effort sites, there are variations in that. But generally speaking, everybody is stuck to an 8 degree rule in the UK. So BCT do provide a measure of a trap night, being 1 lure and net, or 1 lure and trap combination per night. But bearing in mind that there's no specificity on the length of the survey to be considered a full night. So like Scott was saying, depending on the time of year, your survey can be twice as long in October as it is in June or end of May. So a trap night isn't a standard survey effort unit because of that variability in how long you might be out doing a survey. So it can vary wildly on your geographic location, and that as well. It means that if you're using something in units of nights, then the country that you're in, it could swing very, very wildly. So it's no wonder that Eurobats don't really specify that. Survey effort is probably more betterer more betterer, quantified in hours rather than nights. So there is precedent for this in literature. So a net hour is usually a product of net length and time, or of net area and time. This is to do with the height of the net, and rather than so basically most standard nets people get here are like 2.5 high, but then you can get some variation in that. So net area and length is probably the more accurate way to do it. We measured in length per hour rather than area per hour, but so it's a measure of the area and the time that the area of net is deployed for. So it's a specific measure of deployment effort. So surveying for a set number of nights doesn't provide a way to standardize effort. And the other thing is that going back to sort of like the academic or conservation-based projects, a lot of the time what you're able to actually deploy in a woodland is determined on what equipment you own or what equipment you've hired. And so you don't necessarily have 60 meters of net to deploy. So this would, if you were to adopt a strategy of measuring your deployment in net hours, then you could reach the same level of survey effort, regardless of how little equipment that you had, but basically by just putting in more hours. So you wouldn't have your hands tied by saying, oh, you must have this amount of equipment for this amount of site out for this amount of time. It just a measure of net hours sort of takes all of that hassle out of the equation. So so a minimum number of nets makes amateur and self-funded academic research prohibitively expensive, and we want research to be happening. So when setting up guidelines for surveys like this, they need to be set up in such a way that it's not going to reduce the amount of research actually happening and the biological record being generated. So the idea of net hours gives you flexibility in equipment deployment, and flexibility in your survey duration as well. So harkening back to that, I can't make my volunteers survey until 5 in the morning. If they've done a 40-hour week and it's a Friday night, that's okay. We can survey for 3 or 4 hours and then come back next week. And then we're using the same amount of equipment, using net hours. We can make sure that we've had the same effort at the same sites, using the same people and the same equipment that we've got. Everything is standardized, but not in a way that makes everybody exhausted or costs a load of money.
So, as Morgan said, resources, money, equipment, the availability of licensed surveyors, personnel, and time, they're all finite things. These surveys require skilled licensed surveyors. Your average bat worker can't carry this out. And initially, they can be a financial outlay. So, for example, with my old job, we did some trapping, and what we needed for the site after a walkover was I decided four harp traps, 4 triple bank harp traps, and a net in one location. I scoped it all out, figured it out in my head, found some nice spots. So a harp trap's usually about £2,000, and then with them, we're talking about like £9,000 worth of kit potentially. If you include lures, it could get up to 10. That just completely removes the profitability of that one survey. So instead, what we decided to do was we rented the equipment from bat groups. Thankfully, I'm involved in quite a lot of bat groups, and quite a lot of bat groups have kit, and they were nice enough to loan and charge at a reasonable rate. So it very quickly it adds up. The thing is as well, if you're doing this a lot, mist nets are a life item. If you're being really biosecure, really your mist nets should be kept preferably to a site. I mean, that's unrealistic in reality because they're about 50 quid a mist net if you're going for 6 meters, but they are perishable. Bats will chew through nets if they're in there too long.
Birds will fly right through them.
Yeah, woodpecker will go straight through a bat net. Bat nets are much thinner than bird nets. A big bird's got no problem going through one if it's going fast enough. And they last about a season if they're being used a lot. You're gonna have to cut a bat out every now and again. Some bats they'll just go in. Pipistrelles particularly can be quite difficult to get out of mist nets. They just hit them and barrel roll and get all tangled, and you've got to balance now I could get this bat out and not cut my net, or I could just cut this bat out now and get it the hell out of there. So they don't last too long at all. 2 seasons out of a net is good unless you're willing to go and sow all of your nets all the time.
Which we do.
Yeah. Voluntary bat group and research projects. It's people that work at this level usually work at this level and are very passionate about what they do and do a lot of volunteer stuff. But at the same time, people that are working at this level and are consultants probably do not have the time on a weekend because they're probably working on weekends on these professionally. So it can be very difficult to get the skilled people for this, and they're usually charging a premium. So it all comes down to if you don't have these resources in house and you're having to pay an external consultant, you're having to get the traps, you have to buy the traps, you're having to rent the traps. You need to know the minimum survey effort required so that you can basically figure out what you need and cost it up and to make a profit on this work if you're a consultant. And at what point does survey effort reach a point when you cannot justify spending any more money, or you can't justify spending any more volunteer time on there? At what point is it time to go, we have disturbed the site as much as we can on an ethical point of view, we've disturbed the site as much as we can on a monetary point of view, and in times of people hours? And at what point can a survey team be confident that they have recorded the majority of the site's readily caught species? And that's important. Not all bats are caught the same. I have nightmares about horseshoe bats that I've seen avoid traps. But beyond that point, you're getting diminishing returns. But beyond that point, you can't really justify being at the site trapping anymore. That's why there's a need for evidence-based guidelines, which would allow surveyors to trap with efficiency and confidence that with their limited resources, they have done a good enough job for the site.
The second reason that that we think that we need to have some more specific guidelines is because of its implications on bat welfare. So and this is based on the fact that early species encounters are dominated by common or ubiquitous species. So common species dominate the catch. And generally speaking, these species which dominate the catch, which for us, and I'm sure for most people, are common and soprano pipistrelle, Daubenton's, brown long-eared, and noctules. All of those species are readily identifiable using acoustic devices. And so if all you're going to do is throw up a net, catch some common species, why are you causing that disturbance? So unless you either are doing specific research that requires you to take morphometric, biometric data, DNA, or etc., or you're going to push past the point at which you're dominated by these common species. Ethically, you've really got no justification for the level of disturbance that you're causing to these animals. So if all you want to do is to get a species assemblage for a woodland and trapping is the way that you're doing it, it's absolutely legitimate, but you should push past the point where you're only getting common species. And so we wanted to quantify that a little bit, and we're going to go into it a bit more. But basically, a survey should continue past the point where common species dominate the catch in order to justify the collateral disturbance to all of these common species, which you could otherwise just record, even using it like, just like an EM touch or something like that, that you could be doing these surveys. If all you want is assemblage data, you could be doing it acoustically. So there are plenty of cases where there are exceptions, as I've said, species-specific surveys, DNA sampling, ringing schemes, any kind of constant effort stuff. But if it's just assemblage data, then there's a huge ethical consideration with misnetting for short amounts of time. So throwing up some nets to see what's about, is very hard to justify.
Yeah, so Bob Stebbings once said there's too much bat bothering going about. And we're not saying that, I've done this, we've put up harp traps, and the first bats we've caught have all been cryptic myotis. And it's like, oh, brilliant. But that obviously means there's a roost somewhere, and in reality, we've just gotten lucky. The majority of the time, the first bats you're going to catch, common, soprano, noctules, the early emergers, and the bats that are just readily identifiable.
So we wanted to know the ideal advanced bat survey effort levels to establish assemblages whilst using your resources, be that financial, equipment, or staff, effectively, and then maintaining this ethical feasibility.
So we wanted to calculate two values, the minimum survey threshold which is basically the point at which a surveyor can expect to begin to encounter your less dominant species, your small myotis, your Becksteins, your bats that don't emerge till later, the bats that are cryptic on bat detectors, the real reason you're there, the bats that you've had a recording on your detector and it's like, I've got no idea what that is and I really should be looking at it further. And the known species threshold. This one, we kind of figured this out when we were doing the statistics. But the known species threshold is another useful point, which is the point of which a given percentage of the known species assemblage for a site is likely to be reached, and beyond which there is likely to be a diminishing return for survey effort. So basically, the point of which you should go until, and the point of which you should consider stopping.
Okay. Oh, this is your one.
Yeah. So 2 field seasons, in total 56 surveys, 11 woodlands, caught round about 400 bats, deployed 2. Every single survey was accompanied by 2 full spectrum bat detectors for the duration of each survey. And this is one thing that basically most of the guidelines do really well. If you're trapping, you should have static detectors out. And a point of good practice, these detectors should be nowhere near your lures because you're just going to record your lures going off all night. And you'll be there, oh God, look at these incredibly rare Beckstein's calls. There's a maternity roost in this woodland. No, that's just what your lure's been screaming out. But because things like horseshoes are difficult to catch, they readily avoid traps, and you're only really going to catch them in great numbers around sites where they're roosting. You need to have a detector to catch the things that get past your traps. Because if you ever put infrared cameras on your traps, you will realise bats hit them. They don't always get trapped if they hit them at all.
Okay, so we determine the minimum survey threshold. Again, this is the point at which you can begin to expect to encounter less dominant species. So we, as Scott said, we did 2 field seasons. We caught 383 bats comprising 9 species. Now, what we looked at was the number of times each species was the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth species encountered on a survey. And so because some of those happened after that, the data set that the MST is based on is 134 bats. And so we looked at the first 5 species encountered on each survey, but one of the things that we didn't want to do was to have the bias of these behavioral idiosyncrasies that nocturals come out and then pipistrelles come out. And so what we did was we took the minutes after sunset at which each bat was caught, and we subtracted from that their published mean emergence time. So we basically corrected for this, their emergence, the stratification in their emergence throughout the night. So we were actually looking at what are the first bats that we're catching, not just the first bats that come out after sunset. That we accounted for mean emergence times, and so that took the skew. They were the anticipated skew out of the data for us. So, and the raw data looks something like this. Excuse all of the check in there because I just lifted this out of the paper that we published, which was published in the Journal of the Museum of Prague. But basically, this is, you can see each time Pipistrellus was the first species, each time it was a second, each time it was a third. I'm going to show you in a second a graphic representation, which makes it a lot easier to look at than this. But basically, we split the bats into the dominant and non-dominant. So the dominant common species, like I said, were the 2 pipistrelles, brown long-eared, Daubenton's, and noctule, and then all the other species. But we showed that there was the relationship between species group and encounter was significant with a p-value of 0.00003. So there's definitely a difference between the catch rate of group A with group B species. And here you go. So this is your box plot looking at the group A dominant species in orange and the less dominant species, the rarer species, in green. And as you can see, in encounter 1, 2, and 3, you're more likely to catch the common species than the less common species. there is no point at which the less common species become more likely to be caught because they're less common. So, what we weren't looking for a point where the less common species become statistically more catchable, more likely to be caught. We were just looking for the point at which you could reasonably expect to start having a decent amount of bats caught in that encounter. So you can see that at encounter 3, the lower 3 quartiles are below the mean for the group B species, are below the mean of the group A species. And so basically, I move this out of the way so I can actually see what I'm looking at. So we did binomial tests comparing group A with B at each encounter, showing the probability of a first and second species encounter being from group B is 10%. And so this is a statistically significant difference at encounters 1 and 2. So we knew we definitely wanted to go past that. The probability of the third bat encounter being from group B increases to 38% at encounter 3 and 55% at encounter 4. So you only become more likely, and never significantly so, to catch a rarer species at encounter 4. And also at encounter 5. So, as I said, the lower 3 quartiles of group B at the third encounter are below the mean of group A. And because the encounter rate of group B versus group A didn't exceed 50% until encounter 4, we decided that this would probably be a great place to put that minimum survey threshold value. So we put this at the 4th species encounter. So what we're saying is that that's a point that you have to pass. You have to get to your 5th species in an assemblage assessment before you can feel happy that you're ethically have a right to be there. So we then use species accumulation curves to tell us at what point we could expect to reach that minimum survey threshold, which you'll see in a minute. But first, this is how we determine the KST.
So MST is very much a fixed thing, your minimum survey threshold, but your KST is flexible. So the KST is the point, just a refresher, the point at which we can be confident that we have caught a certain species, we've caught a certain percentage of the species likely to be present, and beyond which we're going to get diminishing returns for our survey effort. So it's a bit more complex because it can be modified, but that gives it some flexibility. And the flexibility is what's important for the potential for establishing better guidelines, is that this can take into account your geography. Your MST, universal across the board. Your KST, though, depending on the species present, if you're a consultant, what's came back in your record search, or what's present in the county, will affect this. So the likely assemblage of bats roosting or utilising the site, and the percentage of those species likely to be caught, some species less likely to be caught than others. So you essentially take all the species, let's say in your county. So for in Birmingham Black Country, we have 12 species so far. A couple of sites that we think will have some more and take us up to 14.
They're there, we just haven't found them yet.
Yeah,
They're
so
definitely there.
Birmingham Black Country, 12 known species. Of those species, 9 can be considered trap happy. So there are 9 species you'll readily catch in traps. The 3 species you won't readily catch in traps are lesser horseshoe, ceratine, and Nethusias pipistrelle. Main reason because lesser horseshoe are wily little things that can see a trap a mile off and are super agile and will just fly around it. Ceratine ceratine we just never really catch. They're very rare in the county. We only know of 1 roost, and plus they fly too high. And then your Nethusias, which again really high flying and incredibly mobile, so you're just unlikely to be at the right place at the right time.
And we literally have no idea where any roosts in our county are.
No clue.
Enthusiasts.
If they even roost in the county.
Yeah.
So we set our value at 75%. 9 of our 12 species like to be caught in traps. So the calculation's done retrospectively. Ours was done retrospectively on everything we caught, because it's important to remember before we did this work, the Birmingham Black Country species assemblage and the distribution of these species across the county just wasn't known. So ours was done retrospectively. In reality, you do this off a record search or off a known county assemblage.
Yeah, to put this into context, since 2017, all the bat records that have been submitted for our county, 92% of them are ours. So no one was looking for bats, and so we had no meaningful baseline data before we did this, and so our calculations for this known species or assumed species really threshold is based on everything that we know now, plus all of the existing records, everything we know now, and then coupled with that all of the acoustic records as well.
Because it's important to remember again, the three species that we consider to be trap adverse, we got them on bat detectors. So always have your bat detectors out when you're doing these surveys. So we then use the species accumulation curve to plot the catches against an MST value of 5 species and a KST value of 75%. So we'd established, because it's a set value, our MST, and then we'd established that the point of which we can expect to have caught all of the bats that are readily caught in traps is 75%. So how long is it going to take us to get to 75%? And to do that, we did the species accumulation curve.
So our data revealed that the MST of 4 species will be passed at the 5th species encounter after an average of 17.4 net hours. And that the KST of 75% of our known species assemblage will be reached on average toward the end of our 3rd survey, from the way that we're doing them, at 29.8 net hours. So bear in mind the number of surveys isn't our measure, it's the net hours, which is our measure. But that's what makes it so flexible. So what you can see here is this species accumulation curves. Now, what sort of throws this out a little bit visually is that some of the sites we caught whiskered and Brandt's bats on our first night within the first couple of hours, and then other sites we only caught 4 species ever, and we never got any of those species group B species. So what you can see is the orange vertical dotted line, that's your minimum survey threshold, and then the green one is the known species threshold. So the idea is that's your sweet spot there between the two. If you look at this species accumulation curve, visually it's a little bit misleading, because you could go, oh, but look at the you get to your 5th species on this within the first sort of like 5 hours, and that's just not the case. It's just skewed because some of our sites were wildly different from other of our sites.
Yeah, so you've got the error bars on here. It's also important to remember that the end goal of this work is for it to not really stop here. Hopefully we can get more data, because this is only off our species assemblage. What we want in the end is to have, from a collection of sites from across the country, to remove as much skew as we can, of up to the 17 species that we get, that we have breeding anyway, known breeding, so that you can go, okay, I have the most amazing bat site in the UK, I've got 17 species.
14 of those are
how long until I've caught all the ones that I'm likely to catch. And that's the most important thing. It's how long until we have caught all the ones that we are likely to catch. You can get, like, if you're likely to catch is a generalization. If you put a harp trap in front of a cavern, you are likely to catch horseshoes. If you put a harp trap in a woodland path, you are not likely to catch a horseshoe. So there is still a point of, and if you're doing these surveys, you should be licensed. You should obviously be experienced. There is always this common sense. This is the guideline that we're helping you use to improve your survey efficacy, but they're guidelines. You can deviate. So the MST, said before, this is crucial threshold, and it can be assumed to be universal, unlike KST, which is geographically variable and should be worked out per site to a point. So the MST should always be exceeded in order to make your disturbance justifiable, and also to make it so it's representative of what you've actually got. Because all of your Group A species are readily identified through acoustic surveys, you need to get past the MST to basically gone, yeah, I've likely found out more than I would have if I just put out statics. Unless, of course, you're after DNA, morphometrics, radio tracking, ringing, other stuff, which is not what we're on about. We're literally just on about traps, putting traps out, nothing else. So you need to get past that point, which and the likely point is about 18 hours of survey effort. Our KST would be reached by around about 30 hours as Morgan said. You could, in theory, have a site where your KST could be 50 hours or even more.
Or you set it wherever you want, because you go, right, I want to know, I want to be sure of this. I want to catch 90% of my species I'm likely to catch, or whatever. That's down to the survey designer.
Yeah. But again, it's also, remember, 30 hours seems like a long time, but remember, these are net hours. This is done by the size of your traps. You could, in theory, reach that in a survey. In theory,
with enough deployment.
With enough deployment, you could do it in enough deployment. In theory, you got 30 nets. You could do it in an hour. Obviously, overkill, and wouldn't recommend you do that. Just because you'd get absolutely overwhelmed at emergence time. But still.
But then also in the real world, you do have the behavioural idiosyncrasy of the stratification of emergence time. So
again, common sense. In theory, you could do it in an hour, but in an hour's time, it's likely things like your small meiosis aren't even out yet. And as well, you've got to take into account the fact that not all the bats are going to be roosting in the woodland. Some of the bats it's going to be core sustenance zone for some bats. So you do want to distribute your hours accordingly. Right. So when you get to your KST, that's the point you want to consider packing up your dinosaurs and leaving. That's really the point at which it's like, okay, unless there is a species that you're thinking, we should have caught this, we've had it on the detectors, but we haven't caught it, maybe we'll push through a bit more.
Yeah, this is a do as we say, not as we do kind of thing, because obviously we far exceeded this 30 net hours threshold on all of our sites, and we did catch stuff after that. We did get new species. At most sites past that point. So.
Prime example, one of our sites, it's a swarming site. So obviously the bats didn't arrive till very late. We trapped this site a lot.
For 3 years.
For 3 years, It was a common site to go to. And we'd been trapping 3 years. We thought we'd got everything. We thought we knew, okay, BLE and Daurbentons are swarming. The daubs are also appeared to be using the site as maternity roost.
Less horseshoes and serotine.
Less horseshoes and serotine on the detectors. Hadn't seen emerging from the caverns. We know everything we know, and at that point we were very much like, okay, we're probably not going to touch it next year.
It was literally like, this is our last survey in September. Bye woodland.
Yeah, we're going to rest it for a year. We've probably done too much, and then a couple of years before, we'd had some calls that could have been natterers, but at the same time, with daubs inside a cavern, swarming behaviour, it could have been daubs. So we just were like, oh, they're probably daubs, just being a bit weird. And then what hits the trap about half an hour before we're packing up at about 2 a.m. are male natterers. And when we looked at when we'd been surveying with the timings, natterers tend to be an early swarmer. They tend to arrive quite early at swarming sites from the literature. And we'd probably just missed the natterer swarming. We'd probably just been rocking up when the BLEs and the daubs were there, but the natterers had probably been there a bit earlier and we'd missed them.
The other thing is with stuff like brown longate and natterers, like gleaning bats have the luxury of being able to swarm for a little bit longer before they have to fatten up for hibernation, because they're not reliant on volant species. So it might just be that we didn't wait long enough. That doing it at the end of September is probably better.
Yeah.
But
so again, this is
either way,
this is very much a guideline, and I will always stress that we're not saying this is what you must do and you must follow it to the letter. These are guidelines.
So in real money, the way that it works for us with our long-suffering, exhausted volunteers rocking up on Friday nights after working all week, we tend to survey about 4 to 5 hours from sunset. Depending on the temperature, depending on how many, how exhausted everybody is, and we basically we're putting up 2 double high 6-meter nets at most of the woodlands, or we would and this is the other thing about deployment, is that like you don't always have the luxury and the space to deploy the same amount of nets in one woodland to another, because the canopy height is different. You need triple highs in one site to catch bats, whereas you only need single highs in another site to catch bats. And so it's all very variable. But basically, we had a minimum standard for our surveys that we set out at the beginning of two lots of 12 meters. So either in single highs or in a stacked double high formation. So we were getting 2 net hours per hour. So we were getting 10 net hours per survey as a minimum. And so that minimum survey threshold of 18 net hours would have been reached toward the end of our second survey, which ethically means that you'd want to push on to survey 3 in order to feel that you were ethically justified in doing the survey work. And then also, as Scott was saying earlier, with enough equipment, you could reach 18 net hours on your first survey. But would you cover enough of the site? How big is the site? Do you need to move your trapping sites around it? There's so many variables to consider. But the main thing is that you consider this 18 net hours, your a threshold which should be exceeded. It's the start of your survey. The start of your real survey should be after 18 hours, which for us would have been survey 3. And that's the point at which your survey starts. It's now ethically justifiable, and you can crack on.
Yeah. And again, magically, Natural England's guidelines on a class 3 and 4 in relation to a development, you can trap no more than 3 nights.
Which is interesting with what you said earlier about the guidelines saying that it's at least 3 nights.
Yeah, at least 3 nights. There are the point of this whole thing is this is the minimum survey time. This is the point at which you should consider: are you still catching new species, and should you stop? And then how to distribute that time depending on the amount of equipment you've got, and capturing in the 3 main life stages of bats: your early season, your maternity season, preferably immediately before, immediately after, and then your late season. So as opposed to just, you need one survey of indiscriminate time, starting at whenever you feel like it and going until you're tired. These times of the year, it should be, this is how long you should be going through, and you should be distributing this time accordingly across this period. And you may do that however you see fit, as long as you're taking into account all these factors.
Yeah, I mean, what we were basically, this was essentially a thought experiment to kind of trying to bring to light the thought that people should be considering, that they should be deploying for a lot longer than just throwing up nets for a single night, and just sort of like dipping in and out of different woodlands to catch common species, and then also that there should be some kind of specificity in the guidelines that is malleable enough to cater to amateur recorders. Well, I say amateurs are still bloody very skilled, but for like bat groups and conservation groups and academics, as well as consultants. And it needs to be, adaptable for everybody. But mostly, it just needs to be thought about. Someone needs to think about this because there are so many people out there doing these types of surveys with completely skewed survey effort at different times of year for different sites, just because they're trapping until 2 or 3 a.m., etc. And with no guidelines on how much equipment you need, and how many visits and how much of the season you should cover. I mean, we all generally think that these things should be, like anything, that you should cover as much of the season as possible. There's been a good, it'll be in my references, but there was a survey done in the US with temperate woodlands that came to the conclusion that 3 post-June surveys was the ideal minimum. And that just ties in with our stuff as well. We basically think that you should be out for 3 surveys, ideally post-June, to go along with this other study, as your minimum. I mean, we tend to do that. We tend to do 3 post-June surveys on a site now, but with one or 2 spring visits, just to kind of get a feel for the site and figure out where the bats are. But as Scott said earlier, always with supplemented with full spectrum bat recordings. Now, we wanted to talk a little bit about the limitations. In an ideal world, I would replicate this study across multiple habitats, multiple latitudes, across an urban-rural gradient. But the labor intensity of such an undertaking is not practical. This was 56 surveys for 8 people, to do, and then all of the analysis that happened afterwards. So it's the fact that it's a limited study size. In spite of the fact that you think 56 surveys is a lot, it only produced 134 bats of data for the minimum survey threshold. So if I had a time turner, I would definitely be using it to go and do these surveys across different habitats. And I think the urban rural gradient is a thing as well. I mean, obviously we're only trapping in suburban woodlands, and it might vary, according to habitat. Our county percentage is 12. We haven't taken into account all of the 17 breeding species in the UK in this study.
Doesn't take into account vagrants.
Yeah, it doesn't, or anything like that. And our species richness at the sites vary considerably, with a species richness of 10 species at one, and at 4 at another. So the quality of habitats definitely has something to say about your success in your trapping. So, and as I was saying before, we have long exceeded the KST threshold and still continue to record species, which to us was worth all of the extra survey effort. But then again, we were not doing it for there wasn't a financial cost to us. It was literally just we just like hanging out in the woods at night, and eating biscuits. But as Carl Sagan said, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So pushing past that KST, if it's not costing you money to do so, is often worth it. But the key take home, I think, is just getting past that minimum survey threshold and making sure that people are considering the ethics.
And then so the future, in the end, what we want to kind of produce, this would require a serious amount of effort, would basically be a combination of a table like this, where you just go, all the species in the UK, is it present in your county or is it present on your site? And it will tell you your suggested KST of 75%, and then you would follow a species accumulation graph to all the way across until you reach the point at which you've got that percentage, and then you work out your KST. So that would, for your site, be, okay, this is what I've had back on the record search, this is what's present in the county, this is the percentage that aren't trap adverse, this is the species accumulation graph, follow it along, we need to go for
45
net hours.
Or whatever.
And this is the equipment we have, this is how those 45 hours will be distributed across the survey season. Boom. And then you've got consistency. Everyone's doing the same thing using a peer-reviewed method. And unfortunately, to do that, we would need to try to get to that point. It would require a massive effort of numerous ecologists.
Lots of misnets.
Lots of misnets. And that's not possible at the moment because of COVID. But that would be a lovely end goal that we hope we could eventually reach and would in some way be incorporated into best practice. The next slide's not coming up. So this is mine and Morgan's details. If you want to find us on LinkedIn, if you want to follow us on social media, if you want to get in touch or anything like that, talk about it. This is the link to the paper. It's open source. If you want to get it and have a look at it and read it, the actual literature in a bit more detail, it's all there. And it's the list of references.
Tiny print.
In tiny print that you're all going to read, obviously, and pore over. And sponsors and contributors on the bottom. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions.
Brilliant, Morgan and Scott. Thank you so much for that. And yeah, we've got some questions, so it's really good. And we'll just keep you in control of your screen.
Great.
We're okay like this because it means that we can be recorded simultaneously. Wow. Okay, that was really interesting. I obviously had read your paper before you did the presentation. I think there's massive value to seeing the presentation because you get so much more information actually hearing what was done and getting the examples and all that kind of stuff thrown in as well. So got some questions then. Where are we? Written down quite a few things here as we're going along. Okay. And it's just, most of it's just for clarification, I suspect. But can you just remind me one more time, what is a net hour? Is that per square meter of net, or is that?
Well, what we were using net hours as a measure of length times time rather than area times time. So it's 12 meters of net deployed for 1 hour.
Right, on the basis that the net's a 2.5 meter net.
Yeah.
Right, okay. And therefore, as you were saying, if you put two 2.5 meter nets above each other, that in effect would be double in terms of your.
So our minimum survey effort was 2 double high 6 nets.
Yeah.
So that gave us 10 net hours per hour.
Perfect. That's fine. I mean, you did say that, but I just wanted to kind of make it.
Oh, sorry, 2 net hours per
Yeah,
hour. Over a 5-hour survey was 10 net hours.
Yeah, I absolutely. No, one of the things I immediately latched on to your presentation, yeah, is when you said in your survey work you rocked up on site 2 hours before sunset, and absolutely loving that. Absolutely loving that. And I think once you've been doing this stuff a few times, you begin to realize that turning up half an hour before sunset to put up even just 1 or 2 mist nets or a harp trap or whatever, yeah, there are times you might get away with that, but it doesn't allow for.
We have
issues.
When it's 2 of us, we'll take a net out, just the 2 of us, and go half an hour before sunset because we've only got 1 net to set up. But
it doesn't always go to plan though. Nets they get tangled. You just wear the batteries. Oh god, I wanted to set this camera up in front of this trap. Oh god, what lure call should we have on the radio?
That's time we went to Dudley and I realised I'd left the nets at home.
Completely left the net. We had to drive back. We've just got the poles. We've dropped poles down caverns, and I've had to run into the cavern and get it.
Oh god.
And you need, and as well, there is that thing of a lot of our sites we go to regularly, so we know where we're going to put the traps. We've put the traps, and they've not caught anything there, so there's no point putting the trap there. But we know, put the trap there, it catches really well. And put the lure on that one, but don't put the lure on that one. I tend to not like too often putting lures on nets, just because I think the bat's got nowhere really to hide like it does in a harp trap. But so you get to a point when if you're just rocking up half an hour before and you just throw it up and you're just in a panic, oh, we need it up, emergency's going to happen, just throw it there, and then that doesn't catch anything. You need to have a walk around the site, even if you've been there broad daylight. Now it's getting dark. Have a walk around, see what the flight lines are, and really figure out and get a feel for, I don't think it's going to do well there, type of thing. Still, obviously, last night we put, not last night, other day. Last time we did a survey, we put a trap up along the stream, and I was convinced it was going to catch really well, and it caught absolutely nothing. Yeah. And it was a case of, well, that looks brilliant. No.
The other thing that's really important to us is having the time to teach our trainees as well. And so we can go to a site and put up a mist net in no time and put up a harp trap in no time. But unless they get to do it, they're not going to learn how to do it. And so it takes 3 times longer than it should take, but because you have to stop and teach and get them to, we don't tend to, when we tend to do a bit of a baptism of fire with our trainees where we'll show them how to do it, and then they can do it with us. And then after that, we have them teach somebody else how to do it. So it's just like that. So that's in their head. But it does mean that rather than taking down a harp trap in 5 minutes, it takes 20 minutes to do. And that's fine. That's fine because they're learning.
That's how you get. That's part of how you get volunteer engagement, and that's part of what they're getting out of it. And that is so important, especially with your kind of project. And obviously with a consultancy type project, it probably wouldn't be like that, or it might be a little bit like that if the consultancy was maybe doing in-house training or whatever. But you've touched on a couple of things there. Back to the 2 hours before sunset, especially in your kind of environment, woodland environment. Again, until you've actually done it a few times, people don't necessarily appreciate the obvious, that it gets pretty darn dark inside the woodland pretty darn early. And if you do arrive late and something doesn't go according to plan, even the best of people will have a bit of a panic. And then when you have a bit of a panic, that either impacts upon the mood of the team, or it means that something's not set up properly, or there's more risk of an accident happening or something being left on site because it wasn't put in the right place as part of the setup, those kind of things. Yeah. So I'm quite sure you've experienced all of those things.
Allowing that flexibility as well, kind of at the end of the survey as well at the beginning, because you get to the point when it's like, and we tell the trainees, look, we know it's 3 a.m. We know everyone wants to go home and you're tired, but it's still, this is our stuff. This is our project. This is our baby. We have to look after everything. You need to make sure the data are uploaded and synced, because if you don't do that, then why are we here? We lose the data. Like just, and you know, I mean, we still lose stuff in the woods. It happens, but the other thing is that we like to be able to get everything, you know, walk around while it's still light, have a discussion about what equipment we're putting up, and then we're sticking up sort of like, you know, the traps, the nets, the lures, the bat detectors, infrared. You know, there's a lot of stuff to get set up and to get set up right. But we also don't like to sort of go, right, okay, everything's up, open the nets. We literally want to be able to have 5-10 minutes to just go, right, let's sit down and eat some biscuits and then we'll open the nets. You know, everyone can breathe. And a lot of times we have a lot of new surveyors will be coming in, and if you don't have the time to sit and go, right, here's your survey briefing, this is where the first aid kit is, this you know, all the things have to happen at the beginning of every survey. You have to have that moment where you go, right, gang, you know, this is the protocol, you know. And if you're in a rush, if you don't take the time,
you can hit the fan pretty quick.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sensing biscuits are quite important to you, Morgan.
Yeah. Survey snacks are currency.
Listen, here's a question, though, right? How did you account for the impact, positive or negative, for the presence or absence of lures when you came up with these measurables? So you've got your MST and your KST. Did you work out, was that with or without lures? Or how do you stick that variable in there?
Survey effort at every site with regard to lures and traps was exactly the same, so we didn't differentiate.
So if someone was doing a misnetting, heart trapping exercise, for argument's sake, and let's just say they weren't using lures, yeah, how does that impact upon your MST and your KST figures? Does that push them up?
Well, that would be a good question to ask about Conservation Trust, because at the moment their trap night includes lures, and so if you don't have lures, you're not having a trap night.
So what was our measurement for a harp trap? I wasn't included in it.
No, we haven't included.
So our data doesn't include harp traps.
Okay.
So it's misnets.
And we only put lures on traps.
And our lures are only on the harps. Which is important thing.
But that would just require doing it all again, but without lures, and then seeing how the data compares. So it's just so much work.
So with a harp trap at the moment, we'd still consider it to be a harp trap, and a harp trap should have a lure. I mean, obviously,
but not everybody can afford it.
Not everyone can afford lures. It comes into a big thing. You don't always need a lure and a harp trap, because you can get it on a blind corner sometimes, and if it's along a flight line, you don't need to be pulling the bats in. But lures aren't included. That's without lures, obviously. The problem with lures is it's almost impossible to do, because different species respond differently to different calls at different times of the year. You play a nocturnal maternity call at the very start of the season, bat's going to react to it different to at the very end of the season. If you play a nocturnal male singing on a perch, bats are going to react to that different in mating season than they are in maternity season, when the females don't want to know the males. So it's, and
it's what lures are you using?
I was going to add that as well.
Are you using epidermis? Are you using the son? What's the big one? The autobat, the Sussex autobat. Are you using?
There's so many variables.
Do you have a lure spinner on it? How loud is it? It's impossible to measure. And everyone's using distress calls, using mating, all that crap. It really comes down to synthesized.
Like
I don't think impossible.
You'd be like
so we
pulling worms out of that can.
We excluded the lures for that reason. completely was.
Okay, so just to be absolutely clear then, just so your calculations, your MST and your KST
Yeah.
didn't include lures on the nets?
Didn't include lures on nets.
Didn't include. So logic would suggest, therefore, provided a lure was being used appropriately,
Yeah, it would
yeah,
enhance it.
and with all of the other variables, it was a lure that was functioning properly. It was the correct type of call for the right time of the season, etc. The use of a lure effectively could potentially take your figures down a little bit.
It would take down the it would take down it would take the KST down. With the MST, the MST is not a prescriptive amount of hours, it's a prescriptive species encounter.
Yeah.
So if you put lures on your nets and you got your 5th species on your first night, you could be like, okay, we're ethically viable. We've got 5 species now. We're good to go. Like, but do you know what I mean? So like the number isn't important in hours or net hours for the minimum survey threshold. The minimum survey threshold is 5 species, your 5th encounter.
Yeah.
And it just happens to be that for us in our data, that was at 18 hours. But if you, whatever you can do to enhance, I mean, like I said, with some of the sites, we caught whiskered and brants on the first night within the first couple of hours, and it just is what it is. So it's just really, it's just the whole principle of it is just to get people to consider not just throwing up nets.
It depends on
catching pipistrelles.
For example, one of the ones I was doing when I did for work, we were looking for Becksteins. The lures were on Becksteins all night. We were only interested. Everything else we caught was gravy. We identified maternity colonies of whiskereds and sopranos and commons, so we knew we caught sustenance zone of that. But for us, it was a targeted survey. All we cared about was what are the Becksteins doing in this woodland. So our lures at work were just on Becksteins, nothing else. So it's again, whole guidelines thing. If you're doing a targeted survey, yes, obviously you'd still, this is how long we want to go for, just to get everything else that we want to get, the bycatch. But we're going to have lures on it, and the lures are just going to be on this species.
I think though that yes, obviously using lures would reduce would bring down that data. It would definitely affect that data. However, first of all, there's no way to quantify it, and B, if you are looking for a cutoff point at which you're going to say we can expect diminishing returns after this point, then surely you want that to be further away. Do you know what I mean? You want that to be what's the maximum that we can expect, and so you want that calculation to be without lures.
Yes.
You know, if you're looking, you want to go right. What is how much survey effort? At what point do we want to pack up our dinosaurs and leave? You know, that's and if you are using lures, obviously that point in theory would be brought forward, would happen earlier. But you still want to be operating under a worst case scenario that you've definitely put in enough survey effort, but then this is the point at which you can go, right, okay, we need to save some money now, we've done our 30 hours.
Because is always a possibility as well, just an example of like a noctule again. If you're playing a noctule perch call and you just happen to have a recording or whatever of the bulkiest, henchiest male noctule there is, you might scare all the other noctules away.
Absolutely. And then we get into a whole other debate about, about lures and all the rest of it. But I was just interested what your take was on that. And I think, when I say I think, it's not because I'm conflicted, it's because I've been thinking about it as you've been talking. I think you're right in your conclusion for me, in that you've got a measurement here that, it's something that no one else has really done, certainly not in this part of the world that I'm aware of. And it's giving almost like this benchmark or this, this line to aim for. And if nothing else, it's then going to cause people that do this kind of work to perhaps question themselves if they're not planning on doing quite as much work as maybe your figures suggest they should be doing. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to potentially then have to really think through if they're trying to come up with something tangible that they can refer to, they're going to have to really think through why they're only putting the nets out on that site just for a couple of hours on one night, for argument's sake, to disprove that there are no Beckstein's bats or whatever on that side, because it's this is giving something that we can kind of polarate around with the health warnings that you put in from the point of view that you haven't done this for every species, you haven't done this for every habitat type, and you've only done this for, part of one county or one county. but it's a start, and it's a really, really important start. I would say it's significant. What about other habitat types then? You must have had a thought about, okay, how would you anticipate that this would translocate in terms of your measurements into, I don't know, farmland or open parkland or other areas? Any thoughts on that?
I think when it gets to this is when you come into a fact of like lures. I think Matt Cook did something in British Island bats about the Sussex auto bat, using it and putting lures basically in places where you wouldn't think a bat would go into it, and then putting a lure in it and see how it affects it. I think that's when you should be starting to think of, yeah, really, I do need a lure to try and draw something in here, because the beauty of like trapping in woodlands is that you have these natural choke points, you have these natural funnels, you have blind corners, you have all these ways that you can position your trap, and especially with mist nets, which are really flexible, so you can do a dog leg, you can double high, you can do all these different configurations to make a bat mess up and go into your trap. In a open environment, that's where it really gets difficult, and I'd say to a point that's when a lot of luck starts to go into it. But
lures really, stack the cards in your favor. There's a really great paper that came out, was it last year, or the year before, about the Florida bonneted bat. So Florida bonneted bat are a species that up to that point had not been caught in mist nets apart from at known maternity roosts, I think it was. And they basically did a study on the effectiveness of using lures in open areas. Now, Florida bonneted bats are, everything about that bat is facing down. They're a high flying bat. They drop down on their prey. They've got the typical sort of like molluscid kind of ear structure. And as you can imagine, being high flying bats, they just don't catch them. And so they set up these mist nets in open areas, playing lures recorded from this maternity roost, and they caught, I think, 18 bats. They were the first ones I ever caught, and it just a really good example. I can send you the link, Neil. But of the effectiveness of just using lures to bring in bats in an open environment that no one had ever caught before and didn't think was possible to catch, but just by using a really good non-distress lure call to pull in a specific species. And I think that things in those kind of environments, they would need to be species-specific, targeted.
I think the thing I got asked about a survey a couple of months back if I could help with, and it was Becksteins and lesser horseshoe flying along hedgerows, and basically I was asked how confident you could be that it was a Becksteins if you put out a static detector, and said if it was a full spectrum detector and you got a perfect call off the bat flying directly towards the microphone and it didn't overload the microphone and it was no noise background, you could probably be like 70% sure you'd got a Becksteins. Being brave. I think I've only ever been brave enough to say I've had Becksteins recorded once or twice. So I said you probably want to trap it, but then it comes down to bats aren't dumb. They can see your traps. Some of them from a great distance know your traps there. A lot of the time I liken it to it's like when you wake up in the middle of the night bursting for the toilet and you don't turn any lights on to go to your toilet until you get to the toilet. You just walk through your house in the dark because you know where everything is. So you're kind of like relying on the bat walking through its house in the dark to go get where the food is, or go to the water source and not be paying attention. In an open environment, a bat is going to be paying a lot more attention than an enclosed, safer woodland, because the bat's going to be taking the path of least resistance. It's going to be hugging the hedgerow as tight as it can, and it's going to be looking out for
And there's
predators.
predation perception risk.
Yeah. So the thing we can't really stress enough is what we've tried to do here is we've tried to give a benchmark of this is really like this, but at the end of the day, they are guidelines, and professional judgment and experience is so important to be able to not bend the guidelines, but actually make them much more practical and reasonable. And I think as long as a discussion takes place with the local planning authority, if you're a consultant, or Natural England, or if you're designing a scientific study, as long as you know you've got decent references to back it up, you look what others have done, then by all means operate outside of the MST and KST. We chose to do urban woodlands because that's what we were trapping, and also those are woodlands that are at most threat for development.
So, yeah, I mean that when we started this project, it was basically to try to quantify the value of completely unrecorded sites, two bats in an urban environment, in an area where we have this new combined authority and plans to round off the green belt. And so it was really important to us. We felt that there was a clear and present danger to a lot of these sites, which people dismiss. And if you were to do a record search to inform a development, you wouldn't have gotten anything. And so it was really important to us to kind of do that. And that's why we ended up surveying in the woodlands that we're doing. And that's why ultimately all we can really say about our project is that in our study in temperate suburban woodlands, we suggest trapping for a minimum of 18 hours up to 30 hours for maximum survey efficacy to catch 9 out of 12 species.
Yeah.
And it's very specific, and we know the limitations, but also that people should be thinking about this at least.
Hopefully, in the future, in a post-COVID world, we can try and get a massive data set brought together to actually look at across the UK. This is a much more feasible, wider scale.
And I think that should be possible. Look, because as much as we think there are lots of people that do this kind of work, there isn't actually that many compared to, it's only a small percentage of the BAT community that have mistnet licenses and lure licenses and stuff like that, for argument's sake. And I'm kind of trying to think, it's a bit like ringing studies and stuff like that. If you're someone that goes out for whatever reason using mistnets, heart traps, whatever, if there is some other way in which your activities that night can be used to inform a project in order to make conservation and developmental decisions better, then it's pretty darn easy, I think, to say, right, this is how long my nits were.
If there are people who have kept a track of the deployment of equipment and the times at which their species were caught, then we can.
All we need to know is what configuration you had going in terms of net lengths. Hopefully, you didn't have lures on the nets for us to be able to look at it, and then give us a species list of what you caught in the order you caught it. That's all we need.
And okay, maybe people won't have that from past work, but if they're being asked to consider it going forward, it's not something that's going to be difficult for them to take a note of going forward to then share data with you.
I mean, it'd be very easy to just set up an EpiCollect form or something that people could use to let us know the metadata for the site, and then what was your first species encountered, second, third, fourth, fifth. Then we need to correct the.
Because I generally do believe that while this paper is very much like a starting point for something that could be, that it would provide a much more evidence-based approach of, okay, so you've got to trap this woodland. Very quickly, how many species have you had in your record search or present in the county? How many of those species are trap adverse? Boom, boom, boom. That's the point of which you should go beyond. That's the point of which you consider stopping. There you go.
And at the very least, people should be quantifying survey effort in net hours, not trap nights.
So that leads me to something else. But I think, But before that other thing I'm thinking about, you mentioned a couple of occasions that the normal license guidelines from Natural England for misnetting a site, for argument's sake, is 3 sessions.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for most people, bearing in mind your calculations, 3 sessions isn't going to be long enough to satisfy the minimum requirement that you're talking about. So there's a conflict there. And I've always kind of found it a bit unusual the way that Natural England describe how much work you're able to do, because it doesn't specify, you could rock up at a night for one survey site with 30 heart traps, or you could rock up with 1 heart trap, but it still counts as one strike, so to speak. Yeah.
I had this discussion with a client, and they were basically very, very, very eager for us to go out. And can you not get it done this week? And I was like, no, because it's going to rain. I was like, and if we go out and we put the traps up, and in 10 minutes it rains us off.
Yeah.
From Natural England's black and white point of view, and I can guarantee I would not be able to get it in writing that they're okay with this. That's a strike.
Yeah. So it strikes me that there needs to be some sort of conversation there, and maybe your research is a very good starting point with this, where the licensing approach maybe needs to quantify it a little bit more. Well, it just needs to quantify it a little bit better than just basically saying you can only turn up 3 nights. They should maybe say you can, a night is classified as, 12 meters of mist net, within, I don't know, half a kilometre square grid or whatever it is. But it's like they need something else in there that just makes it a little bit more logical. Look, that kind of leads me on to probably the last thing that I'm going to ask you. And please, if people are listening to this live, and I know that there are some people listening to this live, please put questions up in chat or Q&A and stuff, because surely, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not doing such an excellent job that none of the rest of you got any good questions. Okay, I don't believe that for a minute. So while you're thinking about if you've got any questions, those people out there in webinar land, it's probably too early for you to do this, yeah? But why don't you guys write the guidelines on this?
Because people that are very, very, people that are more experienced and more, I don't want to use the word favoured by the BCT, but people that are more probably crop up to the BCT's mind faster.
I don't think when people go, who do we get to write the guidelines? People think, hey, let's get Morgan and Scott to do it now.
I think it's a case of there are people that have been doing it for much longer and are much more experienced, and rightly so, held in a high regard, who are more competent. I would like it if, obviously, the paper were to, and I know one of the people that wrote the guidelines last time has messaged me about it. I would like it if they consider it, and and if it impacts it in some way. But there are several things. So, for example, ringing, I've got no idea how to write the guidelines on that. Radio tracking, I've personally got no ideas how you write the best practice guidelines on that. There's people that have been doing it for far longer than I have. And I think that the people that have the experience, for example, in ringing and radio tracking by proxy, have a lot of experience in trapping. So I think, in my opinion, there are better people to write it. But I do think that our paper could definitely assist them.
I think that what's been done so far. Well, okay, so I think that there's a reason for the fact that the guidelines fall short in specificity in this matter, and then one of the main things is that most people, and this is a hill on which I'm willing to die here, is that in the consultancy world, you go out and you do your dusk dawns, and you say, yes, I've got a roost, and then you get your mitigation license based on the roost that you found. The guidelines, that's step one. You should be going on to roost characterization surveys after you've established that there's a roost. And by and large, consultancies don't do that. They make assumptions. They go, oh, well, there were 6 bats, it must be a maternity roost, but there's no roost characterization surveys. It doesn't get past that point, because the way that the system is it's driven by the need to please the client and to keep the client within the law and all the good things, but then also to keep the client's costs down to make sure that the developments happen. And so as a result, most consultancies end up not pushing past presence absence surveys or presence likely absence surveys. And then so roost characterization doesn't happen. And for sure, advanced surveys don't happen as much as they should.
It's on of the
and if it doesn't happen, then there's no overwhelming need for the guidelines to have specificity, because there's only a handful of people ever do it.
I'm of the opinion that there was a thread in UK bat workers about hand netting, and I'm the firm opinion that where you can, you should, and that if the roost is going to be destroyed, your disturbance is by far justified to get a couple of bats in the hand and say, yes, lactating female.
I absolutely. Absolutely,
yeah.
I'm gonna die on the same hill as you, Scott. On this, I read that. I read that thread, and to be honest, I was quite astonished by some of the responses to that thread as to why hand netting was really used or seldom used. And from my point of view, I find, and you just take something like de Benton's bats, for argument's sake. Just because you've got a large group of de Benton's bats, that does not mean you've got a maternity colony. Is it fair to stick a harp trap in front of that colony and cause that much disturbance in order to establish whether it's a maternity colony or not? Of course, it's not fair to do that.
Catch a couple of bats with a hand net coming out, and then you know. And it's minimal disturbance for accuracy. And I think that's the problem, is that that a lot of consultancy isn't driven by data. It isn't driven by the need for accuracy. It's just driven by, right, we need some results. We need to do this the way that it's supposed to be done and get some results to get the license, to please the client, to get paid, to get the next job. And that means that everything happens in a very minimal way, and there's no drive for accuracy in what you're actually recording. And it's okay to make assumptions. And that's just the convention in the industry, and it shouldn't be that way.
Absolutely. And I suppose I'm a different generation to you guys, I think it's fair to say. And I've got to say, like 20, 30 years ago, when the people that I respected and looked up to, and the people that trained me and all the rest of it, these, using a hand net as part of a licensable activity, that was an extremely important skill to be shown how to do properly and effectively. And I've always grown up with this viewpoint that first of all, you gather acoustic data, and then if you need to catch, or if you need to see, can you look first of all? And then if that's not possible, hand net. If that's not possible, harp trap. And if that's not possible, mist net. And I've got one rule that I have followed religiously. I would never stick a mist net in front of a roost entrance, for argument's sake. And I don't mean by that a cave or a tunnel entrance. I mean like immediately in front of a discrete roost entrance on the side of a structure. You shouldn't need to stick a mist net out in those circumstances. The 99% of the time, I would imagine. So
there's like only one situation I can actually see that being need, and that's if you have multiple bats of a cryptic species emerging from, not obvious, like under roof tiles, and they could emerge from anywhere. That's like
you need to cover a lot.
The only situation. Yeah. And then, to be honest, though, good luck getting a net getting the right length of net.
No, I totally agree. Look, this has been fascinating. Okay, so we've got quite a few listeners. Okay, so I'm not going to call anybody out, because that wouldn't be fair. But please, if you're out there listening to this live, put up some feedback or on chat for us, just because we're about to close things off very shortly, I suspect, because Scott's got his Sunday roast or whatever to prepare.
Mum will cook me a Sunday dinner.
yeah. Put your hands up if you want Scott to.
I'm having a jacket potato.
Yeah. Hands up if Scott should be cooking tea tonight for Morgan. Yeah. Yeah, Inga's put her hand up. Okay, right. So that's definitely two hands. Yeah. seriously, Morgan, Scott, I've been looking forward to doing this for quite a while now. Kind of knowing you guys sort of in different for different reasons over the past couple of years, but this is the longest I've spent in each of your company, and I've got to say it's been thoroughly enjoyable and very interesting. And you've certainly given me, with your paper and the points that you've raised, you've certainly given me one or two things to think about that I don't think I would have been thinking about prior to your research. So I think if that's how it's impacting upon me, I can't believe it wouldn't have an impact on anybody else, or certainly almost anybody else that does this kind of work. So I think you should be congratulated and you should feel really chuffed with yourselves and proud of yourselves about the work that you're doing. And I know you're doing a lot of good stuff down there. And I see an awful lot of good press about your engagement with volunteers and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, good on you. And it's just great that people out there doing this kind of stuff. In terms of the paper, with your permission, I'm going to put a PDF copy of your paper underneath this video on Club. So if you're watching this as a recorded session, just look underneath the video. Okay, don't email me for the paper or email Morgan or Scott for the paper. Just look underneath the video. You should find a link to a PDF copy of the paper. I'm also going to put up one of your email addresses. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, or both of your email addresses. Just in case Sebby wants to contact you about if that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, look for that underneath the video.
Yeah, and we're both on LinkedIn. We're both on ResearchGate, so you can.
Okay. Right. Well, I'll put something up there so people can find you some shape or form. But I'll just do it one way. Okay. So I might do it as ResearchGate. I might do it as your email. I'll put up the Twitter handle as well. Do you have a Twitter handle for this project? I can't remember, for the Urban Bat project.
I just use my one. Okay. Yeah, it's a weird thing about it. I just feel that using a hashtag and getting all 40 of our volunteers to be using a hashtag it has more impact than having a single account. So we just do that. Really, we're both on Instagram.
But I don't do Twitter.
He doesn't do Twitter.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. I only started doing Twitter about 2 years ago. In fact, I think it was around about when BatAbility Club was beginning to start. I thought I'm gonna have to do this Twitter thing now. And because yeah, so yeah, I don't use it personally. I mean, I never use it personally.
No, I don't do Facebook. So
right, okay, wow, okay. Yeah, well, I was only forced into Facebook. This is some time ago now, but it was a student on a course that had come all the way over from South Korea, and she said, "Well, how do I keep in touch with everybody that was on the course?" And I kind of said, "Well, I'm sorry, you don't, because you need a Facebook page." And I famously said in the minibus back to the airport, this is when I ran Eco-Ecology. I said, Eco-Ecology will never have a Facebook page. Yeah. And by the following Monday morning, we had a Facebook page. Because this girl in South Korea just thought, no, stuff it. I'm going to set up a Facebook page for her. So, and you know something? It was probably one of the best things that ever happened, because I just hadn't appreciated back then. I mean, I'm talking maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago now. It was when, and now I kind of think what a stupid thing for me to have said. But there you go. Yeah. Right, so I'm going to stop recording now. And before we do, so don't go away anywhere, Morgan and Scott, but I need to formally finish this from a recording point of view, and that's what I'm going to do. So thank you, everybody, for watching this either live or as a recorded session. Thank you for being in BatAbility Club. Thank you once again to Morgan and Scott for being excellent, be our guests. The very first time we've had more than one person on at the same time. I think also the very first time we've done one of these sessions on a Sunday. So it's been really interesting all around from that perspective. And if you're watching this at some point in the future, check out the other Be Your Guests, Talking Bats, etc., etc. You know where to find the stuff. It's all there on the club portal. So thank you once again for being here, joining us either live or as a recorded viewer at some point in the future. And that's me. I'm going to stop talking now and I'm going to switch off the recording. Wave goodbye, Morgan and Scott.